Maud knew that that morning she couldn't go to the bishop's palace because she knew that King John was staying at the bishop's palace and the whole village had been told to stay in their homes until the bell rang. Now, the rumours abounded as to why they had to stay in their homes until the bell rang, and the rumours were that King John was going fishing and no one was to disturb him. Now, that may sound nothing to you, to go fishing. Why does that matter? Well, the bishop's palace in Bishop Sutton in the south of England is next to the source of the River Arle, where the river bubbles out of the earth. It's a spring of pure water from the ground, and as you will realize, water that is pure, springing from the ground, is treated as holy. And in England, the tradition is you do not fish near a holy well. And surely King John was out there fishing. The bell rang, and Maud went to the palace, to the kitchens, to get on with her dirty work as a good Anglo-Saxon girl in a Norman kingdom. The food was prepared and taken out to the great hall, where King John was sitting at the high table with his lords and all the high folk of the area sitting around. And the high folk and the lords all enjoyed different meats. They enjoyed pork and venison and beef. But King John had fish, a single trout placed in front of him. How did Maud know this? Because she wanted to see the king. She had snuck away from the kitchen, crept into the hall and hidden behind a curtain to watch all the grand folk eat. And she watched as all the lords and high folk ate their meats, and she watched King John take a small piece of trout and savor it. And then his brow furrowed. He took another piece of trout, and he seemed to listen. And a frown came across his face. He ate more of the trout and more, and he said, "No, there is nothing. There is nothing." Until the end, in his anger, he pushed the trout onto the ground and stood up. The folk of the high table and the tables surrounding stared at the king, worried at his anger and frightened what he would do next. But the king simply stormed out of the hall, and the high folk and the lords followed him. The servants quickly rushed in to clean everything up, and because Maud was standing there, she was allowed to go into the high table and clear up from the high table. Normally, as a woman, that would not be allowed. And she found herself at the foot of the high table clearing up the trout, and she gathered it onto the plate and covered it with a napkin and carried it back to the kitchen. But on her way, she found a corner and thought, well, let me ask you, if you know something's forbidden, what's the one thing you want to do? Oh yeah. Once she was in the shadows, she lifted the napkin and she took a little piece of the trout to know why it was so special. And she ate it. It wasn't that special. Trout can taste a bit muddy when it's from a fresh stream. So she took it back and got on with her work. A little while later, the cook said to her, "You need to go and speak to the housekeeper." So Maud went to the housekeeper, and the housekeeper said, "Girl, I've got a job for you. Take this clean linen to the king's chambers. He's gone on the hunt, so he will not be there. Now you be careful not to get any dirt on this linen." So Maud took the linen, and she went up to the king's chambers, and there was a guard on the door who said to her, "Be careful of the fierce beast that waits inside, my dear." So Maud, shaking, pushed the door open and looked in the room, and the fierce beast was one of King John's hunting dogs that was snoozing and grumbling uncomfortably on the bed and just tossing and turning. And so she crept in, placed the linen down, and then she left. She got on with her work, but as she got on with her work the rest of the day, there was like a noise, You know, if you're using an electronic device and you get white noise, that shh sound, that's what she gets. What is that sound I can hear? But the end of the day came and it was dark and she had to go back to her home. So she left the bishop's palace and walked along the path by the river. And as she walked along the path, she heard someone shouting. She heard someone screaming, "Oh, my ears and whiskers! Oh, my ears and whiskers! Let me be safe! Let me be safe!" And she looked around. She couldn't see anybody. And then she heard a voice say, "Oh, you're mine. Dinner tonight." And she looked around to see where the voice was coming from, but she couldn't see anybody. And then she noticed a water vole running alongside her in the moonlight. And then from out of the sky, an owl pounced on the water vole and snatched it. She went back home and she slept. She tried to sleep. She lived in a poor cottage with a straw roof, and all night she imagined she could hear chattering voices coming out of the roof. The next day, she went back to the palace, exhausted because of her lack of sleep. She walked into the kitchen to see the cook talking to the captain of the guard, and the cook saw Maud and said, "That's her." And the captain of the guard went over to Maud and said, "Girl, did you visit the king's chambers yesterday?" And she said, "Yes, sir. I took linen to him, clean linen." And without even answering her, the captain of the guard grabbed her and dragged her out of the kitchen, along the corridor, up the stairs, into the great hall where King John was sitting himself, and he dropped her in front of King John. And King John said to her, "Where is it?" Maud said, my lord, where is what?" And the king said, "My ring. I left to go on the hunt, and I left my ring in my chamber next to my bed, and the only person to go into that chamber was you. Where is my ring?" And Maud said, "My lord, I don't know what you're talking about. I put the linen in your room and I left. I touched nothing." And one of King John's advisors leant over to the king and said, "The girl is lying. Hang her." And King John said, "Agreed. Guilty. We'll hang her on the oak tree outside the blacksmith's smithy." So that afternoon, Maud was taken, her hands bound. And as she stood under the oak tree with a rope ending in a noose in front of her, with the king watching, the Bishop of Winchester standing next to him, the king's hound, the hound that had been sleeping on the bed by the king's side, the Lord. And let's go back to the hound. Because the hound was growling and grumbling and making whining noises. And Maud wasn't looking at the king. She wasn't looking at the bishop. She wasn't even looking at the noose. She was looking at the hound. And she said, "My lord, may I have a last request?" And the king said, "Why not? What do you want, thief?" And she said, "I want to give comfort to your hound. He is clearly distressed. Please, my lord, may my last act on this earth be to give comfort to a poor beast." The king laughed and said, "Of course, why not?" So she knelt down next to the hound. She then moved herself behind it. She put her arms around the hound and rested her hands just beneath its rib cage, and she made them into a fist. And then she punched. And as she punched, the hound coughed, and out of its mouth, in a ball of saliva, the king's signet ring fell to the ground. And the king looked at the ring, looked at Maud, looked at the hound, and said, "How did you know that he had swallowed the ring? All I heard was him whining and yelping." And the king smiled and looked at Maud and looked to his guards and said, "Release her." And then he said to Maud, "How do you like the taste of trout, girl?" And Maud blushed and looked at the ground, and the king said, "Enjoy the gift while you have it, for the gift will not last long, and one day you will taste the trout, and the gift will not come." And so Maud was released, and she enjoyed her gift. But when eventually it faded, at least then she was able to sleep in peace and quiet, without hearing the language and understanding the voice of every animal that surrounded her. And that is my story of King John's trout. And that's how I have told it to you.